Hey, thank you, Sebastian. This is perhaps the third or fourth conference in which I've participated on the question of what's left of the left, which suggests a certain anxiety about the question. In any case, my brief today is to talk about the future of the French left, and I have a forthright answer for you. It will be different from the past, or maybe it won't. So since I'm a recovering mathematician, I know that to assert both a statement, rather a statement or its contrary, leaves me inexorably in the truth. I can't be faulted here. It is going to be one of the two, but I know that politics and mathematics are not the same, so perhaps logic is not our best aid here. In any case, I want to elaborate on what I mean by different from the past, which will require a brief excursion into history. So I want to begin by saying something about the left's past, and to begin with, the French left has always been divided. This goes back to the Congress of Tours in 1920 and beyond. I will resist the temptation to go all the way back to the French Revolution. But we could trace this deep and definitional division of the left throughout modern French history. We also know that the left cannot win in France unless it overcomes this division. And finally, we know that occasions on which it has managed to overcome division have been rare. Popular Front, Mitterrand, and the election of François Hollande in 2012 are cases in point. But this time, it may be different because of wholesale reconfiguration of the sociological base of support of the left to take in a part of the right. And I'm referring, of course, to the Macron candidacy, which I'll get to toward the end. So when I say that the French left has always been divided, what kinds of cleavages am I talking about? Well, the division of the left has traditionally occurred around two distinct axes. First, there have been differences over the means of acquiring power, and second, differences over the relation of the left to the system, which I put in quotes because the definition of exactly what the system means changes over time. Sometimes it's capitalism, sometimes it's the welfare state, sometimes it's the global economy, etc. So to take the first axis of division to begin with, the means of acquiring power. If we go back to the Congress of Tours in 1920, what the left divided over, what divided the communists from what became the Socialist Party, was the question of revolution. Revolution is deeply embedded in the French tradition. And I would say that revolution, it's too narrow to think of revolution simply in terms of acquiring power by violent or extra-legal means. The meaning of revolution in the French tradition is to begin with a clean slate. François Furet's definition of revolution invokes this concept of the tabula rasa, of wiping the past clean, starting over from the beginning. And it's the idea that change can occur rapidly if you bring in new institutions, new leaders. Everything can change. The past has no weight. It can simply be erased, and one can start over. So this question of the means of revolution, excuse me, Léon Blum rejected the notion that revolution was necessary for the left to come to power. He advocated democratic change, which was indeed effected in 1936, but he left a certain ambiguity in that embrace of democracy. If the conditions were right, revolution was still possible, and that was necessary to keep his troops on board. So from the beginning, there was this blurring of the distinction between revolutionary and democratic means of coming to power. Now, in Mitterrand's quest for power, starting in 1971 with the Congress of Épinay, he was unequivocally democratic, but proposed an alliance with the Communist Party, which still had not repudiated the concept of revolution. And Mitterrand built on that concept from the time of the Congress of Épinay to the formation of the Common Program several years later, and then to his final victory in 1981. But throughout all that period, despite his unambiguous embrace of democratic means, he continued to talk of a rupture with capitalism. So the exact contours of this rupture were never entirely specified, but the use of the concept of rupture still implied this notion that dramatic change could be effected in a short amount of time by changing fundamental institutions, such as nationalizing key properties. Now, this revolutionary romanticism lived on throughout the Mitterrand period and afterwards in frondeurs, or rebels within the Socialist Party, from Michel Rocard, who represented the New Left or Second Left, and who, although he unambiguously embraced the market, going beyond simply submitting to democratic means of acquiring power, he came out of a tradition of opposition to the establishment because of his staunch opposition to the war in Algeria. So this legitimated a kind of revolutionary aura around this Second Left, despite its market friendliness. Which brings me to the question, the second axis of division within the left, which is the question of the relation to the system. In the Bloom era, the Popular Front era, the left saw itself as external to the system, and it understood the economy as run by private capitalists and not managed by the state. Hence, its claims were redistributive, to grant vacations to workers, to negotiate with unions, strengthen the laws, giving power to unions, to support strikes rather than use the police to break them, and so on. Now, this began to change in the post-war era. The National Committee of Resistance, the CNR, focused on a program of redistribution as the program for the post-war left. On the other hand, the state became more and more implicated in managing the economy through the state planning apparatus. So you had this continuation of the redistributive program of the 1930s left, plus the needs of post-war recovery imposing a functional need for state management of the economy. Many of the administrators who were drawn into the state at that time had leftist sympathies. Many of them had participated in the resistance, and they acquired this sympathy for the left during the resistance years. This is a difference from this marked a change in the political complexion of the state administrative apparatus, which has always been important in France. Now, in the Mitterrand era, you continue to have redistributive claims, but these were supplanted to some extent by macroeconomic management, particularly after what's called the turn in Mitterrand's policy in 1983. The attempt to have Keynesianism or socialism in one country from 1981 to 1983 led to substantial capital outflows and a problem of foreign exchange, which forced Mitterrand to retrench. There was a change in economic policy, and his Minister of the Economy, Jacques Delors, was dispatched to the European Commission, where he continued his career, and introduced French notions of state administration and economic management at the European level. So this embrace of the need to manage the economy in order to sustain the welfare state, which had become the platform on which left-wing governments were elected, began in 1983. This was a period of learning experiences for the left. For the first time, it had full control of the economy. It brought in state managers to run nationalized industries, state managers who were politically sympathetic to the socialists, but who had to learn the skills necessary to manage a corporation operating in the global economy profitably. At the same time, outside the state structure, there were experiments with autogestion, that is self-management, where workers took over companies that were on the verge of going bankrupt and tried to apply socialist principles to the management of these companies. In doing so, they discovered that there were real constraints imposed by the economy in which they had to operate. This was a learning experience for people on the left. The result of this schooling, this experience in management, had a great influence on the new left, led by Michel Rocard, as I mentioned. He's in the center of this photograph. And arrayed around him are a number of people, young in those days, but who are prominent in the state of the left today and possibly in its future. So we have here Benoît Hamon. This is Jean-Christophe Cambaralis, who is the leader of the Socialist Party. Hamon, as you know, is the presidential candidate for the Socialist Party. To the left of Cambaralis is Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is running on the far left for a party of his own concoction called La France Insoumise. There is Pierre Moscovici, who is now at the European Commission. Here's Claude Barthelon, who is head of the Socialist Group in the National Assembly. And I don't...
What is
yes, and the women, unfortunately, I can't identify, so perhaps someone else knows. So let's go fast forward 25 years later. We have the financial crisis and rising inequality, which have called into question the ability of the left or of anyone to manage the macroeconomy, despite the skills acquired by the socialists in the Mitterrand years and afterwards. We have new redistributive demands arising from the rank and file, who believe that party insiders have become captives to the institutions they manage. It was mentioned earlier that some of them have become very wealthy, and this is seen as alienating them from the people and contributing to the populist revolution that we heard about in the first panel. Therefore, in 2012, Hollande ran as an outsider rather than the party apparatchik that he was for many years. He said famously that his only adversary is the world of finance. Yet, since 1985, we know now that he had been writing under a pseudonym, advocating the very kinds of reforms that he put in place after he was elected, and in which the world of finance did not figure as an enemy. His only recipe for reducing unemployment was to reduce the tax wedge on industry, liberalize labor laws, and increase competition in certain product markets. And all of these reforms were tried and were seen as a failure. The architect of many of those reforms was Emmanuel Macron, who is now running as an outsider. Because of the failure of these reforms, a Front de rebellion broke out within the party, and Hollande's popularity had dropped to the point where he could not run to succeed himself. The primary had conceived with him as candidate in mind, was delayed until the last moment, which was a great handicap for the other candidates. In the end, Benoît Hamon won. He was one of the frondeurs on the left wing of the Socialist Party. And the program which he is advocating is one of eco-socialism. Meanwhile, Emmanuel Macron, who had been Minister of the Economy after serving as Deputy Secretary General of the Élysée under Hollande, formed his own movement, En Marche, and is running from outside the Socialist Party. Since he didn't have to run in the primary, he was able to get his movement going early. And stands in a good position. But there are many who question whether he's really on the left. Current polling has him running second to Marine Le Pen. She's at about 24%. He's at 23%. But in recent weeks, Jean-Luc Mélenchon on the far left has surged and is now at 19%, which puts him within striking range. The candidate of the establishment right, François Fillon, has been beset by scandal and is at about 18%. So we may have and Hamon has faded. He and Mélenchon were initially equal, but Hamon is now running at about 9%. So we may have the unprecedented situation in the history of the Fifth Republic that no candidate in the second round, that the top two candidates will be from outside the mainstream parties. So will we see the left turning in a new direction toward the center, toward what has sometimes been called the social liberal left rather than the neoliberal left? Or will it strike out in a new direction? Both Benoît Hamon and Jean-Luc Mélenchon are proposing what they call eco-socialism. In the case of Hamon, eco-socialism means explicitly accepting an economy with no growth. Now, this is to accept it and not to endure it. One can envision low growth. Europe has endured no growth for the last several years because it hasn't been able to manage to generate growth. I'm always saying we don't want growth because growth is bad for the environment. But that raises a problem. How do you put people to work? How do you pay for the welfare state if you don't have growth? Thomas Piketty, pictured here, who is Hamon's main economic advisor, should be able to tell him that low growth implies another problem, since everyone now knows Piketty's famous equality, R greater than G. When R is greater than G, inequality grows inexorably, as Piketty has shown. If G is 0, then R is going to be greater than G. So in order to compensate for this shortcoming of the no-growth, eco-friendly economy, Hamon has proposed a universal basic income. However, that was his initial proposal. When it turned out that that would cost far more than he could pay with a no-growth economy, he was forced to retrench and is now essentially looking at a supplement to an existing income support program for low-income people, which is hardly a universal basic income and hardly an answer to the R greater than G problem. So that's where the French left stands at the moment. I will conclude by saying a word about France Insoumise, the party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon. In some ways, this is essentially an economic socialist party, not that different in many respects from Marine Le Pen's program, which is to propose a referendum to withdraw from the European Union, allowing France to run its own independent economic policy. Is that really where the left wants to be when this election is over? That's Mélenchon's platform. Or the final alternative, if they embrace Macron, who favors a left and a society based on entrepreneurship, an entrepreneurial economy in which everyone is free to become a billionaire. That was a proposal he launched early in his campaign, which we have not heard much from since. That's one possibility of the entrepreneurial economy. The other is an Uberized economy in which entrepreneurs are driving their own taxis. And perhaps that's not the vision he had in mind. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have Peter Hall.
What do I do to make this show? I just wait. All things come to those who wait. Okay. As Sebastian said, many of you may have imagined that a workshop on the future of the left would be short, and this one has not been short. And I think all of the panelists appreciate those of you who stayed from the first panel, which was very good, I might say, to listen to us. Well, since I'm better at analyzing the past than the future, although some may say I'm not so good at analyzing the past either, I want to begin with a brief diagnosis of what I see as the electoral problems of the mainstream left in Europe, and I was glad to see that these fit to some degree with what Joaquim Almunia and others said just a little while ago. This account is going to be highly stylized. It's going to be a little bit like listening to one of those performances of Shakespeare's works complete works in 10 minutes. And my diagnosis applies more to Western Europe. It really doesn't work well for Eastern Europe, as we heard from Mr. Sierakowski just a little while ago. And there's national variation, right? As Tolstoy might have said, every European country is unhappy, but it's unhappy in its own way. So those are the qualifications. But in the beginning, anarche hinologos, as the gospel says, that is to say, in the 1950s and 1970s, electoral politics in Europe was largely organized around economic issues of redistribution and state intervention. And we heard Art just say something about that. And it was an electoral politics deeply influenced by a class cleavage. On this slide, the little dots, this is stylized, but little dots are meant to represent voters, and the large dots are meant to represent parties of the right and of the left. So this was a politics in which parties and voters clustered along this familiar left-right spectrum. And out of it came the welfare state, which is in many ways the crowning achievement of social democracy, as was said a few minutes ago, and indeed something that is now widely accepted. Well, during the 1970s and 80s, as I think everyone here knows, European and American politics changed. This class cleavage was cross-cut by a cultural or values cleavage, separating what I'm calling universalists from traditionalists. Universalists are these post-materialists interested in issues such as human rights, women's rights, tolerance for diversity, and the environment. I don't imagine there are any of those in this room. The traditionalists are more interested in preserving social relations and the national identity of the society in which they've grown up. And of course, parties on the political left embraced universalist values, thereby attracting a larger middle-class constituency, and you can see them up in the upper left quadrant there. This came at the expense of some working-class votes, but electoral competition, even with this second cleavage, was still organized along a single dimension, which you can see there, the diagonal dimension. And essentially, working-class voters stayed with social democratic parties in this account because those were the only parties that spoke for their economic interests along that left-right cleavage. And I think quite notably, this is a period, all right, so where are we here? I went backwards. So this is a period in which the salience of issues about identity in politics become increasingly important relative to issues, economic issues. This is based on a figure from some work of a Russian scholar that shows the proportion of party manifestos in 13 Western democracies which are devoted to economic issues on the one hand, or identity issues, values issues on the other. So if we think about the current period over the past 10 years, I think the European party system has become fragmented as parties move off this diagonal. So first, we see parties of the radical right moving left on economic issues. So the Front National, starting in around 2005, begins to emphasize social protection and tolerate a certain amount of state intervention in the interests of that. We see similar moves on the part of radical right parties elsewhere in Europe, and I'd say we see that in the case of Donald Trump in this country. And at the same time, liberal parties begin to embrace universalistic values. This is a point made by Noam Gidron, a doctoral student just graduated from the Center for European Studies, who's written a brilliant thesis on these issues. And so in this period, corresponding shifts in political discourse have encouraged a parallel fragmentation in the electorate, which is now spread more evenly out across this electoral space than it was before. And I think that although this is stylized, the empirics reflect this. And of course, this factoid reflects the fact that people's positions on these kinds of issues are not generated simply by some set of social or economic changes. They're also generated by the character of the appeals of parties. So in some ways, it's shifts in political discourse, which are also moving voters across this electoral space. And of course, what's notable here is that many working class voters are in the lower left quadrant. That is to say, they're traditionalist on values, although they're somewhat to the left on economic issues. And of course, the point is they now have there's now one set of parties, only one set of parties that are in that quadrant, and those are the radical right parties. And this is, I think, one of the key factors, not the only one, that's fueling right-wing populism and a cultural revolt against globalization. So the import of these developments is familiar to all of us, and it was mentioned in the previous panel. With some variation across countries, parties on the mainstream left are now leaking votes to the radical left on economic issues, and they're leaking votes to the populist right on cultural issues. So issues of globalization, which are not imagined but are real, but they're at least partly imagined, have driven a wedge through the heart of the social democratic constituency. So on one side are middle-class voters, supportive of universalistic positions on cultural values, diversity, the environment, etc., and somewhat hesitant about state intervention, especially much higher taxes. And on the other side are working class voters who are more supportive of state intervention, redistribution, but apprehensive or even hostile to universalist cultural positions. And that's a problem that was mentioned in the previous panel as well. And I think it defines, in many ways, the dilemma facing the center left in particular. So how does the center left, how does the political left hold its coalition together? And I'm going to close with a couple of brief points, again put telegraphically, that reflect my very tentative answers to that question. So first, I think it's very important for the left to recognize that people who see themselves as losers from globalization and are, to some extent, indeed losers from economic change, often technological change rather than globalization, but those who see themselves as economic losers, what they want are not so much social handouts of the sort associated with traditional redistributive policy. What they want are decent jobs, understood as well-paid, reasonably secure jobs. And I think this is very crucial. And decent jobs are going to be very hard to deliver. But I think delivering decent jobs has to be at the heart of the economic program of the left. So that's my first point. Secondly, if political debate continues to be couched in the terms that I've just described, and these are terms inherited in some sense from a neoliberal era, then if political discourse remains in those terms, this is a losing proposition for the mainstream political left. I think in order to have any chance of taking office and implementing their programs, leading politicians on the center left have to change the terms of the debate. And of course, this is much easier said than done. But my best current suggestion, I mean, you can't just call for this without trying to think of some way to do it. My best current suggestion is that they consider making opportunity the watchword, the central pillar of their platforms. In the Brexit campaign, in the Brexit referendum in the UK, one of the questions that this is from the exit polls or polls done, exit polls from this Brexit campaign. One of the questions that, which I put the arrows on, that most separates those who supported Brexit, leaving the European Union, from those who remained, was a sense of whether there were opportunities for their children. So 22% of those who voted leave, broadly speaking, thought that life would be worse for their children than it had been for them. And in some ways, they're not wrong about this. These are Raj Chetty's figures. They're for the United States. They reflect the chances of someone born in each of these cohorts, 1940, 1950, up to 1980, at a set of income deciles, which are along the x-axis at the bottom. They reflect the chances of that child earning as much as his parents. And I was born in 1950. My chances were pretty good. I'm not quite sure I've made it, but I think that I actually have more than made it. Even though I wish I had been in Greece and had my income doubled, as we were told in the last panel in the early 1980s. But for those of you here who were born in 1980, this is not a very happy chart. So the issues are real, and I think they're issues about opportunity as much as they are about anything else. And I think this matters to the left, and the left should take advantage of it. And I think this involves more than rhetoric. I think it has to include massive investments in skill formation, in education, in continuous learning, inventive forms of continuous learning. It's amazing that we know what that can do and how little we actually do about it, aside from the Scandinavian countries. For instance, subsidies, big subsidies to higher education for working class children. This is something that I think the left can do, and I think it would matter in political terms. I mean, in economic terms, let's not be over-optimistic. This is not necessarily going to create jobs. Educating the populace doesn't automatically create jobs for those people. It sometimes just creates more of the Uber drivers Art referred to. But it will help even out life chances, and it will offer hope. And I think two of the most powerful drivers in politics are fear and hope. If the right has secured a monopoly on fear, which I think it has today, then I think the left can respond effectively with hope. And there's a way in which this sounds facile, but I think it's not entirely facile. I think politics is a creative act that involves the expression of ideas as much as it involves the implementation of policies. And the error of the Brexit campaign, one of the errors, one of the many errors of the Brexit Remain campaign, in my view, was to adopt a position based on fear, the notion that if we leave the European Union, things will be economically worse for you. That was their main claim, and we see how well that succeeded. And then finally, instead of waiting for decent jobs to appear, I think the left should propose and take concrete steps to make existing jobs more decent, with minimum wage laws, childcare provisions that improve the work-life balance, regulations that may not eliminate temporary contracts but make them more humane, and transition support for those among the young and among the old who move frequently from employment into and out of paid employment. And there are ways in which I think Martin Schulz is appealing in Germany, not just because he's a new face, although probably that's what matters most, but he's also speaking to precisely those kinds of issues. So to conclude, the good news is that programs such as these on the left are much more likely to improve the lives of working people than the programs of the political right. And I think that middle-class voters will, by and large, go along with these programs. I think there's evidence in the American case in particular that higher income individuals, in part because they've been attracted to the left on cultural values issues, are willing to accept significant levels of redistribution. The figures on that are really quite striking. In sum, electoral politics is more volatile today than I think at any previous point in my lifetime. Everything is up for grabs, I think. And in some places the left may be sleeping. In other places it may be dreaming. But I think it's too early to say that the left represents the walking dead. All right.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Felix?
Okay, thank you. So it was just after the successful inauguration of current US President that Sebastian asked me whether I would be interested to speak about the left or the future of the left. And back then, the combination of future and left sounded quite like an oxymoron. Somewhat similar to cool-headed Brexit, or to say it with Shakespeare, it sounded like heavy lightness, serious vanity. Now in April, it seems that the situation might have evolved a little bit. Amongst many, former UK Labour Party leader Ed Miliband marvels about the Schulz effect and its potential to revitalize the left across Europe. However, what I want to suggest is that contrary to those optimistic but by and large self-reassuring projections into a future heyday of a left pan-European resurgence, I want to argue that the left risks actually being left behind in the face of fundamental shifts in the political space, which is somewhat similar to what Peter Hall has been elaborating on. And I would want to argue that this is due to the politicization of new issues and not only the rise of populist parties. It's in particular the rise of cultural issues, which did previously not have the political salience to question the left-right distributional cleavage. And this shift, which we've obviously already discussed in the first panel as well, I think comes quite clear if we compare the trajectories of the British and the French left. So that's what I'm going to do. And after discussing briefly these two cases, I'll speak a little bit about how these two cases, or the left in these two cases, relates in particular to Europe. So until today, the British left struggles to recover from the traumatizing impact of the 2008 global financial and economic crisis. The failure of markets at the point still conditions how the British left thinks about its own future. Voters punished New Labour. They hold it accountable for the economic turmoil of the times, as many accused New Labour of having shaped those deregulated markets which failed during the crisis. Led by Tony Blair, Labour was in power from 1997 to 2007, and he was then succeeded by Gordon Brown, who was in office until 2010. And we had a period of economic growth which lasted until 2007, and in those years the British left pursued a form of mitigated Thatcherism. Obviously, after 18 years of Thatcherite rules, its thinking had become somewhat hegemonic in Britain, and Labour stepped quite radically back from its historic commitments to equality, universality, and collective social provision. Instead, what happened in Britain is that the British New Left demonized its internal critics as old Labour and put much less emphasis on redistribution, and instead introduced the new ethos of managerial authoritarianism in the public sector. Obviously, there were some efforts towards redistribution, thinking about the minimum wage introduced in 1999 and the attempts of the education to reform the educational sector. But what counts today is that Labour occupied the driving seat during the economic crisis of 2008. And since that time, the British left has failed to reinvent itself. Its core electorate felt abandoned, and election records have been poor, not only in the 2010 and 2015 general elections. So here you see some of the most recent poll estimates, and we see that Labour is somewhere at 25%, which is the lowest it has ever been over the last 3 decades. And the Conservatives are somewhere beyond 30% despite the Brexit negotiations. So in response to the 2008 economic crisis, voter preferences and party programs not only in the UK shifted profoundly. British voters and the media put excessive blame on the left for its failure to protect citizens from the undesirable impacts of globalization, manifest, for instance, in the British case, but not only, through a rise of youth unemployment or skyrocketing income inequalities. Obviously, if you look at this chart, which is from Piketty's data, it's questionable whether it's actually fair to hold the British left accountable for it, given similar developments that we see in other Anglophone countries. But as we know, politics is not necessarily about who is accountable and what the facts actually are about. Moreover, in the case of New Labour, what is prevalent in the current discourse is that if equalities of opportunities and a degree of welfare constitute the main promise of the left, it's fairly clear to most voters in Britain that the left has actually weakened the main source for delivering this good, namely the state. And after Britain had already abandoned its left with the election of Cameron in 2010, France elected François Hollande in one of the closest races in the history of the Fifth Republic against the incumbent Nicolas Sarkozy. However, what we saw in France is that Hollande's policies neither united the French electorate nor the left itself. In particular, the repeatedly prolonged states of emergency as a response to the numerous terrorist attacks have divided the country and the left. Approval rates, as you know, have dropped to somewhat like 4% in December last year, which is a historic low for the Fifth Republic. And in December 2016, the Conservative candidates therefore already planned their move to the Élysée, but as Arthur Goldhammer has already shown, things look pretty different at the moment. So Alain Juppé's hopes were shattered during the primaries, Sarkozy's dreams of a comeback equally, and the left over François Fillon currently assembled something like 17% of the voting intention for the first tour. So poor leadership in France and the UK and unpopular policies are obviously not the only explanations for why the left risks being left behind. A key difficulty for the left across Europe in crafting a coherent vision for the future is a fundamental split between an identitarian or protectionist left and a more universalist or open left. And we can see that with the split between Corbyn and New Labour, between Podemos and the Social Democrats, between the Italian Democratic Party and the movement Article 1, or indeed Mélenchon, Macron, and Armand. So French presidential hopeful Macron's response to this internal left-wing divide consists in a future vision about politics where the left, as it's known today, will have disappeared. Recently asked to explain what the left and right actually means by a group of primary school children, he asked, the right means more liberty for all, the left means more equality. And what we'll do is that we take a bit of both. Because what's the slogan of the Republic? And of course, you know what the slogan of the French Republic is. So Macron suggests that we should start thinking about a political space which instead distinguishes between, to quote him, backward-looking conservatives and reformist progressives. And many believe that this confrontation will lead to a second round in France opposing Le Pen and Macron. Macron himself presents himself as a political outsider, and Arthur Goldhammer has already spoken about the irony of that. Indeed, he insists on his opposition to the establishment and blames French political class of being disconnected from women, entrepreneurs, workers, and ethnic minorities. Obviously, like all political outsiders today, he was educated at the country's top schools, so he graduated from Sciences Po and from ENA. But what he does is he plays very skillfully with the French political language to construct his vision for the future. He proposes something which France has loved, at least since the 18th century, namely a révolution. So his recently published book, Revolution, It is Our Battle for France, lays out plans for reforms and his vision about the future of the political space without the left. Macron's vision of a political future without the left is one that traces its intellectual pedigree to a French leftist tradition which developed during the 19th century, namely Saint-Simonianism. So Macron affirmed this intellectual proximity last month in a very interesting radio interview, where he underlined his, I quote, belief in material and social progress, technocratic power, progressive values, and spiritual regeneration. So Macron wants to liberate the citizens rather than to punish them by taxation, of which he accuses most of the French left since 1848. So Macron thereby blends left-wing ideals of social solidarity, allocating money to state schools, increasing protections for employees on short-term contracts, or abolishing the residence tax for most of the population, and right-wing calls for entrepreneurship and order, cuts in public expenditure, and reducing the number of civil servants. He also echoes calls for French grandeur. Reaching back rhetorically to the Sun King, Macron stresses, and I quote, France can never be true to herself if she forgets her universal vocation. So overcoming the left-right cleavage, as suggested by Macron, obviously meets harsh criticism. Opponents and the media coined the term Macreux, so creux being a cavity, accusing his attack on the left-right cleavage as being a smart way to pour the old wine of Hollandisme into new bottles, or what's of course even worse in France, of incarnating the Blairist third way. So Macron's funeral party of the left-right cleavage takes place in an important context. Indeed, let's return quickly to Britain. I think it's quite striking there how unhelpful the left-right cleavage is for understanding the only topic which is of relevance in British politics for the next 2 years, namely Brexit. So Brexit instead divides the two main parties in British politics fairly nicely in the middle. Splits across party lines, if we ignore UKIP for a moment, do not really help in explaining the Leave vote, which instead a coalition of affluent Eurosceptics, the older working class, and a smaller group of economically disadvantaged anti-immigration voters carried. Whereas Labour MP David Lammy emphasized his commitment to fight against Brexit and argued recently, addressing a crowd during the March for Europe in London, that Labour needs to rediscover its mojo, other groups, such as the Lexit group here, criticized party leader Corbyn for his very, very hesitant pro-European statements. And then if we move to French politics again, there as well, the relationship to Europe is similarly divisive. So whereas Le Pen or Mélenchon both want to leave the EU and NATO for that matter. It's only Macron really who adopts a very clear supranational vision of France, which he sees as being integral to Europe. He emotionally elevates the relationship to Europe by using the idea of fraternity when speaking to that, about that relationship. And of course, that complements his revolutionary triptych of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And what is even more remarkable, he supports Merkel's decision to have welcomed refugees, much unlike Hollande, who was just very happy that he didn't really have to say much about it. So the current voting intentions for the French presidential elections, for whatever they are worth, precisely reflect this line of conflict within the left. The rise of Mélenchon, in particular over the last 2 weeks, I think clearly testifies to a success of a protectionist left, because what Mélenchon proposes is an expansion of the welfare state, reducing the working hours to 32 hours, lowering the age of pension to somewhat below 60, and of course, closing French borders. And that is opposed by Macron, who captures many of the more internationalist and cosmopolitan supporters of the left. In ways, I would agree that the left-right cleavage has certainly been helpful to explain distributional conflicts between top and bottom, which could be addressed through taxation and a welfare system. And obviously, distributional conflicts have not disappeared, but it seems that cultural conflicts have become central to politics in a new way. The dividing line is to reformulate Macron's pertinent reading, I think, of contemporary society, one where those who believe that social and economic problems would be solved if we lived in ethnically or culturally homogeneous societies are opposed by those which value universalistic or cosmopolitan values and believe that changing demographics can reinforce societies. For the future of the left, I think what needs to happen is that the left needs to bridge the tension which Brexit or the splits of the French left unveiled. It needs to cater for those citizens who value open borders and internationalism. And the question is how the moderate left wants to position itself against the protectionist demands which come from the populist left and right, and how to preserve a respect for agency and autonomy in a context where the discourse of equal outcomes seems to have much more grip than that of equal opportunities. Thank you.
Antonio.
Sorry, I need to. Sebastian, can you help me in? Thanks. Get my PowerPoint. Okay, here we are. Okay, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation to participate in this very interesting conference on the future of the left. Sebastian invited me to present a case. So in a way, we are going back to the first part of our workshop, since I'm going to talk about Portugal and about, curiously, a case where we can say that there is apparently no major crisis in the political representation of the left. As of day before yesterday, the voting intentions of the Portuguese Socialist Party, who is currently in government, is 39%. The major center-right-wing party is 32%. And for the first time after 40 years of Portuguese democracy, the Socialist Party has a cabinet supported by the communists and by the Portuguese equivalent of the Podemos in Spain, or let us say a party that belongs to the same political family of Syriza or Podemos, in this case the left-wing bloc. Of course, needless to say that Portugal, of course, it's also a case where is quite present the decline of the socialist political family, as in Europe. If there is something that, at least since the beginning of the year 2000, the figure is always the same. There is a clear decline in voting of the Socialist Party, of the moderate left. But in many countries of Europe, I think, we cannot speak of a crisis of the left as such, since, of course, we have seen a lot of new protest parties emerging in the left-wing side of the political spectrum. Of course, in Southern Europe, the constraints of the Eurozone, especially the constraints of the Euro, the bailout programs, etc., in the case of Syriza, is obviously one of the most important cases, where the Syriza is, of course, in government with a policy that it's not exactly the policy that made them come into power and to win elections during the crisis. But as you can see, populist parties of the left are also a very important, let us say, part of the political left. So what can I say about the Portuguese case? Well, first of all, let me just 2 seconds of introduction. First of all, there is a strong legacy of the left in contemporary Portuguese democracy for 2 main reasons. First, the Portuguese transition to democracy in the 1970s, Portugal is a clear third wave, of course, it's a part of the third wave of democracy, but contrary to the Spanish case, or even in the Greek case, the Portuguese transition to democracy was a simultaneous process of democratization and decolonization that and state crisis with nationalizations, agrarian reform, and the birth of the Portuguese party system was very much conditioned by a very important and strong move towards the left of the political spectrum in 1974-75. And the main legacy, it's probably the constitution, the Portuguese constitution. Portugal has one of the most left-wing oriented constitution of all third wave democracies of the 1970s and 80s, with all social rights in the constitution, etc., etc. And I will explain later on very briefly why this is important. Portugal, as other countries of the Southern European periphery and Ireland, did suffer a lot with, of course, the crisis, the financial crisis, with a very important bailout, as Greece, as in a different, I think, more, let us say, moderate way, Spain, but of course as Ireland. As many analysts did, as a matter of fact, write in that period, Portugal was in 2011, 13, 14, a quiet version of Greece. A quiet version of Greece. Why? First of all, because the bailout in Portugal came with anticipated elections and a strong majority of the center-right. So with a very stable center-right cabinet. Second, because the program of the center-right-wing government were agreed, of course, with the Troika, was implemented without much blame shifting, as in other cases. As you know, one of the main characteristics, of course, is countries of the Eurozone and the bailouts, and even in other crisis juncture, is the typical blame shifting towards the European Union. We are doing this against our will. One of the most interesting, as a matter of fact, academic article I've read last year, published in a political science journal, was a content analysis of the speech during the crisis of the center right-wing government in Portugal and Prime Minister. Very, very few blame shifting. Why, in the way? Because the center-right and the government of the center-right did have the political will and also the capacity to basically try to reform state-civil society relations in Portugal, liberalizing the economy, privatizing, etc., reforming many aspects in agreement with the Troika during the bailout period. Much to the surprise of the left, in 2015, the center-right wins the elections. In coalition with 30 6% of the votes. The Socialist Party, 32%, losing votes towards not the communists, but mainly the Portuguese equivalent of the Podemos, the left wing bloc. But even so, with 32% of the votes. And in a very unprecedented move, a typical social democratic party of Southern Europe decided to knock on the door of the extreme left and invite them to support a socialist cabinet. A very unprecedented move, since in Portuguese democracy, minority governments are current. There is no obligation to have majority in parliament, and the center-right did win the elections. So the tradition was the formation of a minority cabinet of the center-right. And for the first time in 40 years, the, in theory, majoritarian left in parliament decided to support a government of the Socialist Party. Needless to say that in the case of Portugal, I will go very quickly. In the case of Portugal, we still have, first of all, a communist party on the left-wing side of the political spectrum, a communist party, full stop. It's not the neo-communist, the post-communist, whatever you want to mention. It's simply a communist party, full stop. Then we have the BE, the Bloc de Esquerda, a typical extreme left-wing party, the equivalent of, as I've told you, of the Podemos and the Syriza, who is a typical party that got some voters, around 6, 7, 8% socialist voters, discontent with the moderation of the Socialist Party during the crisis period. And a socialist party and a center right-wing party, too, as a matter of fact, the PSD and a small right-wing party. In 2015, as you can see, the percentage of vote in left-wing and right-wing parties is very monotonous, very monotonous. There's, in a way, nothing new. The left, the right, the left, the right, the left, the right. The left, meaning in this case, basically the Socialist Party in government, of course, with the two, the communist and the left-wing bloc. So reactions to the crisis. We can say that in the Portuguese case, using Hirschman's well-known phrase, in the Portuguese case, apparently, the crisis of loyalty led to exit, in the sense that Portuguese voters, immediately after the crisis, did not vote in, and there was a large offer of both radical right, populist, or even neither left nor right populist parties, because there was enough offer in the market to vote for, but led to basically to exit. One of the most interesting, I think, figures is that during the crisis, immediately after the crisis, this exit is also very clear in terms of the different reactions of non-conventional participation, in this case in Southern Europe, during the crisis, demonstrations, rally strikes. Portugal is the green. In terms of bloc, it's flat. Demonstrations or rallies, look, Greece, Italy, Spain, and the green line, Portugal. Of course, there is a dark side of this, and the dark side, of course, is a weak civil society and, in a way, an alienated type of society. But at the same time, it did certainly contribute to the resilience of the Portuguese party system, since with very few changes, the only innovation of the Portuguese party system in 40 years of democracy is the emergence of the left-wing bloc at the beginning of the year 2000, more or less around the turn of the century. When you look at the evolution of vote in the two major parties, you see, of course, there is a decline, but there is, after 2009, both the center-left and the center-right are back into business, contrary, I think, to the current crisis, let's say, of the mainstream parties in other, and I will basically mention Southern European democracies. In terms of voting intentions, this figure is very interesting because after 2015, with the socialists in power, with the support of the communists and the extreme left and the Podemos, the voting intentions in the socialists is increasing. Last month, 39%, with the center-right with 34%. So to conclude very briefly, first, there are cases where the resilience of the party system, where party systems can resist, let us say, to the crisis. In the Portuguese case, of course, probably the answer is this blend of apathy versus the capacity of political parties, especially on the left, still to frame attitudes of those who participate in elections. Because we need also to correlate this dimension with the capacity of, for instance, unions still to frame social movements. And we know quite well that in many other democracies in Europe, unions are losing, of course, that capacity to alternative forms of social movements. In the last year and a half, with the socialists in government, after 4 years of the center-right, even some very interesting figures are changing. So political space for populist parties is decreasing. Why? In the last Eurobarometer, as of December 2016, the satisfaction of the Portuguese with the current functioning of their democracy is around 52%. It's exactly the European average. But the interesting figure, or the interesting thing, is that in 2014, it was around 32%. Of course, there is a correlation to do with a certain optimism, like to say, in terms of economic recovery, and also, of course, some of the measures of the socialist government in terms of to finish with the budget cuts, etc., that were done during the adjustment period. So, is it Portugal a sort of an old-fashioned democracy? Many of the factors of the crisis are still not there. In a way, yes. In terms of the resilience of the party system, in terms, for instance, of the capacity of the capacity of unions still to frame social movements. But when you look at the left-wing side of the political spectrum, the answer is probably clear in two dimensions. First, the existence of the Communist Party, that is still an important party, not just in electoral terms, but also in terms of the capacity of the communists to frame social movements. In the case of Portugal, and also, of course, of a move of the Socialist Party, in a way, an opportunistic move, because the Portuguese Socialist Party did not move to the left. There is not a single sign. It was not the left-wing sector of the party who decided to do this agreement with the communists and the left-wing bloc. It was basically the threat, as a matter of fact, the threat of a new minority government of the right that could undoubtedly continue the policy of a more global liberalization of state-civil society's relation in Portugal. It was in the way that threat to that made this agreement possible. And this agreement, and that's the current situation, did open what we may call a sort of a very fluid behavior of the voters of the left. So we don't know who is going to win with this new political experience in Portugal for the first time, to have, let us say, a political agreement between the socialists and the extreme left. Who is going to win? The socialists are clearly convinced that they are going to win, in the sense that they are going to recover voters from the extreme left, at the same time that the Portuguese Communist Party is a party that is completely stagnated in terms of electoral results in the last 15 years. Never less than 7%, never more than 8.5%. So socialist parties, not exactly by ideological reasons, in certain cases can still tries to challenge the decline of the moderate left. And that's apparently the case of Portugal, where for the time being it's still not much of the walking dead. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. Gianni?
Can we close this? Yes. First of all, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I have a son at the Crisis of the Left. At Columbia Master Graduate School and a daughter at Georgetown. So today I could boast that I was invited, Sebastian, thanks to you and the other friends, to discuss at Harvard. And of course, when a parent can boast with his kids, it's always a good day. It's a bad day when you are the last speaker before dinner. And okay, I'm done. Thank you. No, and so I'll try to be as brief as possible. The most optimistic speeches today on the future of the European left were from the mayor and from Joaquin Almunia. And I'd say because they are fighters, they are politicians, they are people that know that no matter how bad it looks, the only thing you can go is like, tomorrow let's go back to work and try. And when we go on the analysis, the situation seems quite bleak. For all the leftists in the audience, you can take heart, because if Sebastian organizes a panel next month on the right, we can simply turn the speeches that we're preparing on how badly things are going for the left and give them about the right. Think about this in this country, the Republican and the Democrats. Now the
I'm not planning to
Republicans
do it.
seem they are very, very, very in good shape, but trust me, they are not that much in good shape. But we are supposed to talk about Europe, and so let's talk about Europe. The European left is stuck in the past. I won't give you all the fine-tuning demonstrations because it's too late, but I invite you to reread a very old document. It's online. The critic that Karl Marx wrote in 1875, when the Socialist Party, it wasn't called the SPD then, but it was the German Socialist Party, presented their program at Gotha. It was called The Critic of the Program of Gotha. It's one of the best things that Marx wrote in his life, and he was a terrific writer. If you, let's go to the end. Marx was wrong, and the socialists that he completely destroys in that brilliant pamphlet were right. They believed in incremental growth, cutting hours for the worker, paying them more money, giving them some kind of welfare that at the time was really initial. And Marx destroyed them brilliantly, saying, you'll never get those things. The state, the companies will never give you that kind of insurance, social insurance, welfare, we call it today. So Marx was wrong, and the future SPD was right. But what is interesting in the discussion is that they were both discussing about the future. The program of the socialists in Germany was they were asking about something that the workers did not have. did not dream. And Marx, as a great thinker, was saying, this is not even enough. We have to ask for more. When you look at the debates today, it's about the past. And Almunia said something very important today, because as a polemist, as a columnist, it's easy for me to say it's about the past. But Almunia was right today when he said, because the past was good. I mean, there are kids in campus who would say it was bleeping good, okay? So it is right to defend, but what is impossible, this past is not demographically, socially, economically, it's not gonna repeat itself in the future. If you look at the French election, these are really the election that will shape Europe even more than the elections in Germany. And if you look at the really leftist candidates, Mélenchon and Hamon, they are saying, well, we actually, since the 35 hours didn't work because the French economy is not in good shape, we could reduce them to 32. And that's the first idea. The second idea was universal salary. That is a very interesting idea. Beppe Grillo, the maverick comedian turned politician that now runs 30% of the vote in Italy and may come out first of post next year in the election in 2018 as the same universal salary. And then they found out that it is difficult for them to pay universal salary, so they have a economic manifesto that is a 20th century economic manifesto. And the only way the reality of the 21st century pops up is that when they say, since we have taxed people enough, you know what we should do? We should tax robots, okay? And once we tax robots, you'll see that the economy will be great again, okay? So the past is, the left is stuck in the past. It lacks passion. It lacks passion. If you look at our society is changing fast, much faster than we expected. The society that the left knew in the 20th century was a society of masses. There was production, was a mass production, was mass communication, mass media. The school was the same in the same country for the same from the north to the south. There was mass consumption, and people really thought in masses. The communists, the liberals, the socialists, the Christians. We live in a society that is completely atomized. The late Polish philosopher Zygmunt Bauman used to call it the liquid society. I prefer what the Cardinal of Milan, Cardinal Scola, conservative cardinal, calls the Babelization. Our society has become like a Babel. Each of us is an individual and talks to the same app that the same guy next to him is using, but they don't communicate. There is a very brilliant book trying to analyzes how the youth engages the world. It's called Up Generation. Read it if you haven't read it. And Up Generation is true. My generation, I was a radical leftist as a young man. My friend Martin Burkhardt remembers it as the capo redattore of the Daily Manifesto in Rome. But we really believe in changing the society through a mass movement. Now the kids believe in an app. Okay, I have this app, and with this app I will change my life and I will change society. They won't. And millennials have a very, very, very raw deal in the 21st century. I think that the left needs a passion. People, ISIS mobilizes people because they give them a passion. It's a nasty passion, it's a terrorist passion, but it's a passion. The populist, Le Pen, Grillo, the Labour Party that is kind of populist, Trump in this country, they give people passion. don't mistake me. 2012, I wrote an op-ed on foreign policy destroying Beppe Grillo and the Populist Party in Italy, and they still look to bash my car. They did actually bash my car in Rome. I wasn't in the car, so it was nice, but it was a nice car. It was a Fiat. The interesting thing is that the left does not have this kind of passion. Hillary Clinton in this country, her campaign was cold. Bernie Sanders tried to steer passion, but his economic manifesto wasn't good enough for the voters. Macron says things that I believe and that I agree with him, and I think he's trying hard to find a way, but clearly there is a lack of passion there. Ammonia, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see him like, going there and putting fire in the people. So they need, the left needs a passion. And then the left needs to go back to the dispute between Marx and the socialists and talk about the future. They won't. 65% of the jobs that the millennial generations are going to do are not even around yet. They haven't been invited. They have not been invented. They'll do jobs that we don't even think. They will not be steel workers. I'm sorry for President Trump. I'm truly sorry for President Trump. But the coal mine won't open. The 7 dwarfs used to work in a mine. Today there will be 1 dwarf. Because the other 6 dwarfs, they would be robots, okay? But unfortunately, the new technologies do not produce enough jobs. So all my friends across an MIT that say robotics will save us. No, because robotics is a great thing, AI is a great thing, but so far they destroy more jobs than they create. So we have to invent something. Don't ask me what, because I have absolutely no idea. But clearly, we have to invent something in order to have a new social contract. Because if we don't have a social contract, if the left doesn't have a social contract, saying, I cannot give you the same job that you had last century, I cannot give you the same welfare, I cannot give you the same pension, but I will try to build a kind of new social contract with you. Not only that, but you won't be an individual. We will be a community together. You won't be like, okay, when the things are good, we are all comrades, and when the things are bad, I'll write a book of memoirs like Blair and Obama for 60 millions, and you'll be on welfare, okay? No, we are a community. If we try to do this, I think there is a future for the left, because after all, what is the left about? The left is about compassion. The history of the left is about seeing something that is wrong and say, let's fix it. Then the history of the left is ridden with ways that they try to fix things, and they didn't fix them very well, but at least the intention was good. Let's see something that is wrong and try to fix it. Today there is a lot of things that are wrong, a lot of things. But if the left wants to fix them looking at the past, they will fail. I didn't say anything about Italy. Do you want to know about Italy? I'll tell you Italy about overnight. It's a mess. It's a mess. It's a mess. But it's actually a little less of a mess that we expected, because we thought that we were going to have elections this year and that Grillo was going to win. Instead, we are going to have election next year. The economy is doing better than expected, but poorly. The business model of the country is rotten. Corruption is still rampant. We had brilliant young politicians that people loved. 2 years after, Matteo Renzi, 2 years after they loved him, they hated him. So now we have a very, very, very sound and serious politician, a very good friend of mine, Paolo Gentiloni, as a prime minister. He's trying to, he knows that he's ruling the country in a house of cards. Okay, he's leading out. So he knows that if he acts abruptly, everything is going to collapse. So he's trying simply to shift the country to next year and hope that next year he'll squeeze a majority so that he can have a coalition government with the right wing. Where? You remember Berlusconi? Still around, still with his 15% of the vote, and he hopes to have a seat at the coalition. This, of course, unless Grillo wins the election, and unless Grillo makes a Greek-style coalition of right and left, assuming that Grillo is left, with the Lega, with the former fascist, and they squeak like 51% in the chamber and the Senate, and they run the country. I have a dual citizenship, so I'm okay. On the other end, here there is President Trump, and so if I'm squeaked by Grillo and Trump, you know, life is funny. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gianni. So now we have about 15 minutes for questions. So I suggest I'm going to take 3-4 questions to close the panel. Yes. You can please identify yourself quickly and please also make the question very brief.
Speaking. I'm Ellen Rosen from the Women's Research Center at Brandeis. I was wondering, what do you think of the French president's right to have a 32-hour week? Wouldn't that make jobs more available to people?
My name is Christine Zabel. I'm one of the visiting fellows here at CS. I guess I have a question to maybe all of you. I hope I can bring it together. I have a question about the left's policy of the future. Because it seems to me that the left has a real problem that, at least if we believe the theorists and scholars of capitalism who say that capitalism could only develop with the acceptation, or when people started to accept that the future could be inherently different from the past, and that capitalism's main impact is to create images of the future. Jens Becker just stated that in his new book, creates images of the future that can be better, or images of the future that imply that the future can be better. But for the left, it's an inherent question how much we can derivate, or how much the future can be different from the past. And I think that makes it very difficult in a way to talk about hope or opportunities, because the left has always the problem to be a utopian future. But how can we speak about, or how can the left talk about an improved future, or where there can be opportunities, but also be concrete about the outcomes? Because I think the divisions of the left is exactly about the concrete examples, and I think the left has a much bigger problem with that than the right-wing populists, because right-wing populists can always refer to a past that has an ideal past that has already been there. They don't need to create an image of a future that can be so different from the past. So I think the left is kind of in between that capitalism, or at least like the form of capitalism we see as an organizational economies that is about corporations. So the left is stuck in between the capitalist images of the future and the right-wing populist referral to an ideal past. And so, as you said, now the left is stuck in the past and just uses images that used to be future dreams, but now they're past dreams. So I was wondering how a left can deal with this policy of the future.
There's a question in the back. And another one there. This one. This one over there.
Thank you. So my name's James Williamson, and I'm interested in. Okay, sure. Picking up on when you mentioned corporations, that's connected to what I was going to ask about. It seems to me that there's a trajectory on the so-called left, which is corporate capture or moving into alliances with corporate wealth and power, which in turn leads to disenchantment, to a misguided search for what ends up being right-wing populist pseudo-alternatives. And the left, as long as it's stuck in this relationship with corporate interests, is not going to go anywhere. So how do a left come up with a politics that breaks with this relationship with corporate power while at the same time coming to terms with the questions about economic prosperity, which I think have come up a fair amount. But there's a companion piece to this which I'm curious about, which is the role of participation in politics and the role of voice. I think another element in the discussions has been the feeling that people don't have any voice, that they don't have any power, that the Europeanization has meant less power. Nationalism can not necessarily be right-wing. It can be just, we have more power if we have more local governance and sovereignty. We have more of a chance of having a voice. So that then raises the question for me that comes through in the Polish comment about the disenchantment with the politicians, having feathering their nests and abandoning a politics that is linked to the needs of the majority. How do we get more accountability? All of the problem with all political parties is people get elected and they forget about the people who elected them. So who are coming up with ideas of putting forward mechanisms of accountability where politicians, the distrust that people rightly feel about politics and politicians, there's a corrective that people can maybe begin to have some confidence in.
Okay. You still have a question? Or?
Thank you. In German constitution, there's a term really important, one of the most important, this basic act, social economic social market economy. The same term is used in Polish constitution. I think that it is important when we try to analyze the approach of not only politicians, because they are really important actors, but then there's also society. In Italy, especially, it is, for me at least, obvious that a nation can change everything in just one year. This is the fate of former Prime Minister Renzi. But to what extent this term social market economy can influence more left or more right-oriented policy, especially when we have such a deep financial economic problems as it was in Portugal, for example. And also, I think that we have to take into account the position of the Supreme Courts and Constitutional Courts in dealing with, not only in dealing with this financial and economic crisis, but also with the future policy. I think that especially in Portugal, it was visible that the Constitutional Court played a really very important role in social policy, in financial policy. So I have a question to Professor Pinto Gomez. how do you assess, let's say, policy of the Constitutional Court of your country in dealing with, not only in dealing with this crisis, but also with the future policy of the parliament and politicians, and also the way the court creates a kind of social peace and confidence of the people with the country and with the system.
Okay, thank you. So why don't we have 5 minutes, it's about 1 minute per person. Why don't we go quickly through the panel?
Okay, on the 32-hour week, the length of the legal work week in France is really a notional thing. The current legal work week is 35 hours, but people actually work longer than that. The average number of work hours is somewhere 38 and a half. So Macron's proposal is to introduce more flexibility into the work week, to allow individual firms to negotiate with their unions what the work week should be, and to allow some flexibility in that scheduling depending on the stress on the productive capacity of the firm, which varies with the number of its orders. Whether that will create more jobs, the reduction from 39 to 35 hours did not create more jobs, did not reduce unemployment. So it's dubious, although Germany has a similar system with Kurzarbeit, where in times of low capacity utilization, the number of hours is reduced so that unemployment is shared rather than having some people laid off and other people continue. Christine's question on the image of the future, I think one problem for the left is that the left has really accepted Margaret Thatcher's dictum that there is no alternative to capitalism. It's trying to play with different images of what capitalism looks like. But I think the mayor of Athens told us that there really is no alternative to capitalism. We have to adapt to it in one way or another. That adaptation may take different forms according to different societies with different cultural traditions, but in one way or another, adaptation is necessary. My story about France was a story about learning how to manage capitalism. The problem for the left when it manages capitalism is that it becomes responsible for the outcome. It can't simply blame the system as such. It has to own the system and say that if we've failed to produce, then some alternative may be required. So I'll share the floor with my colleagues.
Well, these are good questions, and they all require far more than a minute to answer. And I'm reminded of Oscar Wilde's famous comment that the problem with socialism is it takes up too many evenings, and we probably shouldn't go there ourselves. So I'll simply concur with Art on the 32-hour week, which is, the 35-hour week was not as popular as some originally thought. And I think, let me say a word about Christine Sauvel's comment, because I think you identify exactly correctly one of the, as I see it, one of the core dilemmas of the center-left, which is that it needs, on the one hand, to create passion and generate a vision for the future, and I think develop policies which will require activist government in order to create jobs. So in other words, policies that will be something of a radical break with the last 30 years. On the other hand, in general, parties are elected only if they can appear to be competent to govern. I mean, I think in a sense this is exactly what you're pointing towards. And the problem is that after 30 years of a kind of neoliberal consensus, the notion is that competence means neoliberalism in many ways. People are suspicious still of activist government and the like. And I think that is the dilemma, one of the dilemmas facing the left. And I think that if we recognize it as such, then, as I was trying to say earlier, I think it is possible to escape that dilemma by accepting, in the first instance, perhaps a little more of neoliberal rhetoric than I might believe in, but using it to make a case for activist government and for inventive policies in the name of the future and in the name of opportunity for the future. So yes, I think you're exactly right about the dilemma, but I think it's not insoluble, and that some of the politicians we heard today actually give us an example of how it can be addressed. And I'll say one word about James Williamson's comment. I wish I had more time to speak, but I don't. How do we break the corporate capture? The corporate capture is, of course, most evident in this country, and without electoral reform, we're not going to break it, right? But more broadly speaking, I think your comment points to what I view as the enormous importance of reviving the trade union movement. And that's a twofold revival, which on the one hand means expanding its membership, and on the other hand, it means expanding its membership into the most difficult to organize parts of society, so that trade unions aren't seen as the protectors of those who are in privileged positions to begin with permanent contracts, for instance, as opposed to those who are not. And I don't think we say often enough that the future of the left in electoral terms actually turns, in my view, heavily on the future of the labor movement in the workplace.
Okay, so on the first question, I don't think that the amount of hours that people work is the problem in France. It's the problem that it's very hard to employ someone because you get into very long-term obligations. And if that doesn't change, then if people work 32 hours or 35 hours, I think that's not going to revitalize the labor market. Then the question of the images of the future. So I think, Christine, the past future images that we see with someone like Mélenchon, who speaks about redistribution and protection and equality of outcome, that is sort of bringing up ideas of a future which stem from the early 20th century. And they are probably totally impertinent in the 21st century. I think that Macron, however, he offers an alternative. I mean, he has a discourse which is geared towards autonomy and opportunity, and that is a very different tradition of how the left has thought about the future, at least since the Second World War. And that, as I said in my presentation, links back to these early 19th century French leftist traditions about technological progress and how technological progress might be able to transform societies. And that is where he says that the French society would have, for instance, the capacity to integrate migrants by believing that technological transformation can have social transformation and make people interact and make societies more cohesive. So I think he has in his electorate program possibly a vision for the left, which is proposing a clearer picture of the future, which is not just updating past futures and trying to somehow model them to the 21st century. And on the point that James made, I just wanted to add to what Peter said. I think it's a real challenge for the political left to also think about what to do with the populist demands about that people are not represented any longer, but that they are voting and then they feel disabandoned. And I think the populist parties have a very important point there, which the left needs to think about, is how to integrate the citizenry in a way that is less disruptive than what we saw with Brexit, because that's certainly not a future that the left envisages. But still, I mean, especially with technological progress, I think there are opportunities to mobilize the citizenry outside of referenda such as Brexit, but to get to more advisory forums or committees, or what they did in Ireland about gay marriage, where they had a discussion with people that were randomly drawn from the population in order to get ideas about what the population thinks. And I think that's where the left so far has not been very inventive. And I would say that the left-wing parties probably need to have a little more creativity using technology to bring citizens into the political process.
Okay, so well, first of all, if by any chance Sebastian decides to organize another workshop on, for instance, the future of the right, because let us admit that the right also needs a lot of discussion, because the future of the right, or at least the moderate right, is not exactly brilliant. But anyhow, there is an actor, a political actor, that I think we probably should add to the discussion, and that's the European Union. The way how the European Union frames national debates in democracies about these cleavages, and in the case of the left, of course, about marge de manœuvre of left-wing proposals and policies, at least within the constraints, for instance, of the Eurozone and of the European Union now consider it the Eurozone. On the question on the Constitutional Court, yes, as a matter of fact, I don't think in other countries under adjustment programs like Greece, Spain, to a less extent Spain, but Ireland, the constitutional courts were central players. In the case of Portugal, they were the central veto player of the adjustment program and the process of internal evaluation during the Troika years after the bailout. And this is very interesting, I think, because it's in a way a legacy of, let us say, of the Portuguese constitution. And even although the nomination of judges is in a way politicized by political parties, the only study, and it's a serious one I know, illustrates quite well that regardless that the attitudes of the judges are not related to the left-right-wing cleavage, for instance, who or what party did appoint them. So in the case of Portugal, yes, the Constitutional Court was, in a way, a more important veto player than the left in terms of the adjustment program during the years of the adjustment program. Yes.
Gianni.
Thank you. Very briefly, I totally agree with the lady. The past shifting from the paradigm from the past to the future is crucial. It won't be easy though, because it's not a matter of political philosophy. It's a very practical matter of voters, because there are in great constituencies, retirees, unions, farmers, that vote the left or still vote for the left, in as much the left grants that nothing changes. Because if you touch something like subsidizing for agriculture in Europe that is very big, or union laws, or trying to shift resources from the old to the young, they will react. So I agree, it is necessary, but it's not easy. I agree with the gentleman in the back too, that to look at corporation is very important at this point, even if once we look at it, we'll find surprising things. Because, for example, in this country, even the electric companies, the utilities, are now to the left of the president, because they say we won't go back to coal, just to be very rough, left and right. But while the president says, okay, and there are immaterials companies, Facebook, Google, Tesla became the first, the market decided that is the most important automotive company in this country, investing more than in GM, still employs a fraction of what. So even a corporation, we have to look at them because it's a crucial sector, but with new eyes too, because sometimes they are better than the politicians, to our surprise. Let me finish on, we didn't discuss defense, and we pretty much did not discuss terrorism. Because the European left does not discuss defense, and the European left pretty much reacts to terrorism only when there is an attack in one of the capitals. Even the Labour Party has gone to a very neutralist and unilateral disarmament position. And this is a totally legitimate philosophical position, totally legitimate. Problem is that it's really politically difficult to keep in Europe today, because there is a lot of pressure from the East, from Russia, and of course from the Middle East, and because there will be more and more attacks from terrorists. So I think the left has quickly to design a sound strategy, both regarding defense and a better strategy regarding terrorism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I want to finish thanking all the panelists from both panels for the provocative and stimulating comments. Thank you to all of you for being here today. And also I want to extend my thank you to Elaine and the staff from the Center for European Studies that they, as usual, done a wonderful job putting it all together. So thank you, everyone.